It may not be as famous as the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco.
And it may not be as recognizable as the Brooklyn Bridge. But its place in history as well as its importance has never once been in dispute.
From an economic standpoint, the New Hope Lambertville Bridge was more important than the Golden Gate Bridge, more important than the Brooklyn Bridge, because of the economic benefit that it brought to these two communities.
While the Delaware River might separate New Jersey from Pennsylvania, there is along this scenic waterway an exception to that rule. Roughly halfway along its journey between the two states, you will find a pair of river towns. And while some might say they are joined at the hip, the fact is New Hope, Pennsylvania and Lambertville, New Jersey are joined at the bridge.
Most people in the two towns view us all as one community.
And there's just this 1,000-foot wide river here that sort of separates us, but we're really together.
These two towns have grown up together and really had begun their mutually beneficial relationship long before there even was a bridge here.
The area had become popular as a crossing place since it was midway between Philadelphia and New York City, our two principal population centers. The old Indian trails had been redeveloped and became what we now know as Old York Road, and this was a principal way to move goods and services between the colonies.
Old York Road was the way they traveled, and Old York Road was a very difficult road to pass. But then when you got to the river, you had to cross the river on a ferry boat, which meant that if you were carrying luggage or if you were carrying products, if you were a commercial traveler, you had to unload these things, load them onto the ferry operations. Maybe your horses swam behind if it was good weather, and they eventually took your goods across the river to Lambertville. This was a very time-consuming process, and time is money.
If the current's too hard, it was probably very difficult to get them across. There might have been a week or two where everybody just had to stay on one side or the other to get back to Pennsylvania or to get over to New Jersey.
It depended on the wind, the snow, the rain, the ice. So there were many times you couldn't cross the river at all.
While that may not have been good for travelers, it was certainly good for the hospitality business that had begun to open up as a result.
The Logan Inn was established in 1727 as the ferry tavern. So often travelers going one way or the other would stop here on their horses, leave their horses, spend the night, and then they would use the Ferry Street ferry actually to cross over the Delaware River from New Hope to Lambertville and vice versa.
At the time, however, the two towns were not known as New Hope and Lambertville.
On the Pennsylvania side, it was originally called Wells Ferry. There were a number of ferry owners, and that's how it had its name. The Jersey side was originally the Coates Ferry, and then from there it was the Purcell's Ferry, and then the Coryell's Ferry with a charter from King George II in 1733. So it was Coryell's Ferry on both sides of the river.
Crossing the Delaware in the late 1700s was indeed an arduous and sometimes even treacherous task, as experienced by Washington and his troops just a few miles downriver on Christmas Day in 1776. But Washington wasn't the only future president to cross the river that day. Just a few miles to the north, and a few hours earlier, another Delaware River crossing was taking place.
This is the famous 1848 painting by Emanuel Leutze, German iconic painter, of Washington crossing the Delaware. This is supposed to be a representation of a Durham boat with Washington standing up, leading his men, leading his troops. This is supposedly Lieutenant James Monroe carrying the Betsy Ross flag behind Washington. Washington crossed at McConkey's Ferry, 7 miles south of us here, 6 or 7 miles south. Lieutenant Monroe, on a special command and control mission for Washington, crossed here at Coryell's Ferry.
And now, nearly 2.5 centuries since the event took place, Monroe's famous crossing is still remembered and commemorated every year by scores of Revolutionary War reenactors.
It wasn't long after the American Revolution when an enterprising young man by the name of Benjamin Parry would come to town and change the fate and face of these two river communities forevermore when he and his business partners purchased the ferry operations that had been previously owned by the Coryell family.
Benjamin Parry is considered to be the father of New Hope. I mean, he wasn't the founder, but Parry was the mover and shaker in the early part of the 19th century.
Parry had amassed a small fortune in the mill business on both sides of the river, and his ferry operation was also making a tidy profit. Ever the visionary, though, Parry knew that the ferry business was not the future of crossing the Delaware.
Around middle of 1809, Benjamin Parry probably got wind of the idea that there were plans to build a bridge about 3 miles north of New Hope in what is now Center Bridge. And he got to talking with his friend and business partner, Samuel Ingham, about getting together an application and actually applying for a license to build a bridge here in what was then Coryell's Ferry.
With legislative hurdles soon cleared, Parry went to work on financing the bridge, testing the influence and reputation of the Quaker industrialist.
What I have here are $20, $50, and $100 denomination bond notes. They had to reach out to local people, and different people lent different amounts to the bridge company to get this done.
They got several businessmen in the area, Cephas Ross, Joseph Lambert from the Lambert family, and they got together with, believe it or not, Charles Stewart, who was Commodore of the Constitution. And within a few months, they had raised sufficient money. They needed about $68,000 to build a bridge.
With financing now in place, the next step would be to hire the engineer to design and oversee construction of the span. As far as Parry was concerned, there was only one man up to the task. His name? Lewis Wernwag.
Lewis Wernwag was a famous industrialist beginning in the early 19th century. Not only did he build 22 of the major bridges on the eastern seaboard, he owned and ran a nail factory. He patented rail cars that were self-regulating. He patented bridge construction. He built a prison. He was quite an industrialist.
Born in Germany, Wernwag gained instant fame in America for designing a single-span bridge in Philadelphia that crossed the Schuylkill River. The structure was so big for its day that it could only be called one thing: the Colossus.
The Colossus had a 340-foot span. That's an incredible span for one arch. It was so big a span that the local population wouldn't go across it when he first built it. And he got a 20-ton rock in the back of a wagon with 10 horses and drove it himself across the bridge, and everybody said, okay, I guess we can, use this bridge now because he did it. But it was one of the wonders of the world.
It was little wonder that with the Colossus of Fairmount on his resume, Parry was insistent that Wernwag would be the man for the job.
Parry was looking for a bridge builder and heard about this fabulous bridge and said, well, I got to have the best, so he got Wernwag involved.
The Delaware, however, is not the Schuylkill, and the river made famous by Washington crossing it some 36 years earlier posed many challenges for Wernwag.
On the Delaware River, when you could have a very strong river flow in the spring, especially after a freshet, when the ice breaks and all this ice is rushing down the river, you needed quite a span from the normal river height to the bottom of the bridge.
The engineer was faced with another problem. How do you keep an open wooden deck bridge from rotting within just a few years?
Wernwag's whole idea and concept on prolonging the life of a bridge was to separate the timbers. So you had individual pieces of timber that were sawn in half to inspect the interior for weaknesses or rot. Then those were all separated by steel washers and lag bolts that would go down between the members so that there was an airspace between all the arched structural members of the main beam that carried the load of the bridge.
What Wernwag originally came up with was a two-lane open wooden bridge. With the design in place, next came surveying the river to determine where the all-important pylons that would support the structure would be placed.
And the pylons started with triangulation surveys from the shore to very accurately pinpoint where they would begin. And they were very large pieces of rock that were carried by barge and dropped very carefully by crane sometimes. They had cranes on these barges, and they would put them in place. They weren't just a pile of rocks. They had to be nested together pretty carefully so that they wouldn't shift.
With the pylons in place, work continued on the wooden span. And while Wernwag was still hunched over his drafting table working on the final details of the design, he was never far from overseeing the actual construction of the bridge.
I think he was just down there on his hands and knees watching the guys put in the pegs and nails. I just have a sense that he was that kind of a guy.
The board of the New Hope Delaware Bridge Company convened a special meeting on September 12, 1814, declaring the bridge ready for crossing. While Wernwag had designed an open structure, the bridge was covered shortly thereafter and turned the two river communities into a transportation hub.
It provided an easy way for finished goods to travel all the way between Philadelphia and New York.
Transportation between Philadelphia and New York increased through this area dramatically at that time because people knew you can get across, you didn't have to cross a bridge, you didn't have to wait in a hotel after an overnight, you didn't have to stay here and wait for weather to improve. You could just cross the bridge and get up over to Lambertville and up to New York City and be there in a matter of another day.
The bridge connected what was the principal commercial American roadway of the day, the Old York Road, making it perhaps the most important bridge in North America at the time.
From an economic standpoint, the New Hope Lambertville Bridge was more important than the Golden Gate Bridge, more important than the Brooklyn Bridge, because of the economic benefit that it brought to these two communities. Not just the communities, but the communication and travel from east to west and west to east, and the industries that grew up around that. So I think in its day, it actually was more important than those major bridges that we talk so much about.
The just completed bridge was having a dramatic impact on the surrounding landscape as new buildings were springing up on both sides of the river. The Delaware House in New Hope and the Lambertville House were among the first to be built. Merchants and stagecoach operators alike had come to depend on the bridge to do business.
All of the roads along the stagecoach and the transport lines were now given that advantage of having ready access and reliable access over the existing roads and bridge into Philadelphia also.
The bridge offered reliable transport between New York and Philadelphia. And not only was it more convenient, it was less expensive than the ferry tolls as well. But that was all about to change in January of 1841.
There had been some very heavy early season snow, real cold blasts at the first of the year, and then you got to around the 4th and 5th of the month of January and the rain started.
That combination of heavy rain on a frozen ground unable to absorb it, along with the melting snow, put a torrent of water into the Delaware River basin.
Let me read to you an article from the Hunterdon Gazette of 1841. At an early hour this morning, we heard the roaring of the waters and hastened to the scene of the destruction.
When you're talking flooding on these rivers, you're talking about a river that's raging.
Large coal boats, heavy sawed logs, and cakes of ice were lodging against it and had forced apart one or two of the piers on the Jersey side.
An incredible flood of 1841 devastated the bridge, knocked a large chunk of the bridge out.
One half of the noble structure, which had stood the freshets for nearly 30 years, had been suddenly carried away.
Wernwag's wooden bridge would prove to be no match for the flood of 1841.
To describe the scene we have witnessed today is painful to the extreme.
bridge was gone. And that was when they had to go back and rely on the ferry operations. So that was the only way you can cross them, which people weren't happy with.
New Hope and Lambertville had become dependent on the bridge, and there was no way the two communities were going to permanently return to ferry boats to cross the river. Almost the moment the water subsided, the work began to repair the bridge. 6 months and $40,000 later, the bridge was up and running, and Lambertville and New Hope were once again open for business. Manufacturing began to take hold with factories like the Universal Bag Company, which eventually became the Union Camp Paper Mill.
Many industries sprung up on the Jersey side, and some on the Pennsylvania side too. Keep in mind that the mills in Pennsylvania was what supplied an awful lot of product to everyone in the area. So you had the spoke mill, India Rubber, it started in 1860. You had in 1849 the Lambertville Iron Works. You had the Perseverance Mill. So there was a lot of industry that came into town, and the bridge was one of the main enablers in order for the industry to actually prosper in this area.
But Mother Nature was about to strike again. In the final days of the summer of 1903, hurricane rains had soaked the Delaware Valley, saturating the ground up and down the banks of the river.
So when the heaviest rain came in the first week into the second week of October, it just opened literally the floodgates.
The flood of 1903 was dubbed the Pumpkin Flood because of the thousands of pumpkins that had been washed out of their fields and could be seen bobbing up and down the swift current of the raging river. But it wasn't the pumpkins that would serve as the battering ram. Instead, it was the massive timbers and debris that would supply the knockout punch to the span.
And out went the bridge for a second time.
It just washed it totally away, it was gone.
This bridge section landed in New Jersey near Bowman's Hill on the shore after being pushed down the river, banged around on the rocks, pushed up on shore. Of course, the side was torn off by then, but the thing was still intact, which tells you a great deal about the integrity of the construction.
Once again, New Hope and Lambertville were without a bridge. But just as the two communities had done before over 60 years earlier, they vowed to rebuild again. But this time, it would be different.
The current configuration was constructed in 1904. It's an open Pratt truss bridge. It's got 6 spans, approximately 960 tons of steel, a little over 1,000 feet long. The kind of uniqueness of the Pratt truss is really that it can take longer. It can span longer spans than other types of trusses at the time.
Just as Phoenix had risen from the ashes, a bridge had risen from the Delaware riverbed. The shining brand new steel bridge would open up to connect the two communities once again on July 23, 1904.
Truth be told, the day before, 2 local men, Alfred Holcomb and James Naylor, went across the bridge in a wagon hauling coal.
Townspeople on both sides of the river wanted to be the first to cross the bridge, the first to pay the toll on the bridge, even the first to jump off of the bridge.
A local man named William Gaddis, who had run a ferry boat operation across the river, had jumped from the bridge carrying an American flag, perhaps in protest, we really don't know, but the newspaper reports of the time say that he was uninjured.
Reporters from far and wide had descended on the river communities, and much like the reporters of present day, they wanted to be the first to get the story.
The bridge is a beautiful structure and well built. It is with general rejoicing that the new structure is completed in due time to boom the fall trade for our merchants. Hunterdon County Democrat, August 9th, 1904.
Some papers even carried side-by-side pictures of the old bridge and the new bridge so that readers could compare the two structures. Now, the reporting was colorful and perhaps even opinionated.
The flood of 11 months ago subjected the people on both sides of the river to many inconveniences, but in the long run, they are better off than before, having a bridge now that is in every way superior to the one which was swept away. Trenton Times, July 22, 1904.
The two communities were in a celebratory mood, being once again linked. No one even seemed to mind that the toll to cross the new bridge had increased.
A man named Frank Scarborough, a New Hope resident, was the last person to pay a toll crossing the old toll bridge before it was swept away, and the first person to pay the 2-cent toll on the new bridge.
The new bridge would be an instant hit, serving both rail transportation and that newfangled four-wheeled machine that was being cranked out of Detroit.
It was about commerce, so you had kind of certain industrial operations still up and down along the river. So there was river traffic, there was timber traffic, there was a different industrial kind of route. The mills were on either side of the river. It was a different bridge. There was a kind of light rail or trolley that ran on that river until the 20s. So it was more of a real connector for industry on either sides of the river.
For more than half a century, the new steel bridge would serve reliably and durably as it spurred on commerce and helped spark an arts revolution on both sides of the river.
New Hope was known as an art colony. You had the music circus in Lambertville. This made it easy transportation and easy access from one side to the other for the colonies to grow.
But Mother Nature was about to test these two communities and their bridge again with what would be her worst flood ever on record.
We weren't expecting a flood in '55. This came as a total surprise.
We got word that the town was going to flood, and a fellow by the name of Peter Pascuzzo, who owned the mule barges, rounded up a bunch of us kids, and he rounded some trucks up out of the quarry. And we went door to door to try to get people to leave. And of course it was very difficult because here's a 14-year-old kid knocking on a 50-year-old person's door saying, you know, your house is going to be flooded and we're going to move you out. And they weren't going to buy that program. So we didn't have a whole lot of success. A few people did move. And then after the river started to come up, of course, they all wanted out. And by that time, the water was in the street and we couldn't get to them. So a lot of them had to stay put in their homes. They moved into the second floor.
My wife and two little boys moved all of our stuff. We didn't quite get everything upstairs before the water started coming in our house.
Horrified locals watched powerless as the raging river destroyed their properties and wondered if Mother Nature in all her fury would once again take their bridge.
There was a lot of concern that the bridge would go because bridges above us had already collapsed.
House came down the river and hit the bridge.
A lot of people were just standing around waiting, knowing that it was going to go and wanted to witness it.
It appeared to be a foregone conclusion that towns were about to lose their third bridge to yet another Delaware River flood.
I wouldn't have said the bridge was going to be there when it was all said and done.
The flood of 1955 stands as the flood of record on the Delaware River, the likes of its destruction having never been seen before.
When the water went down, I think the greatest relief was that the bridge was still there.
The '55 storm would have obliterated a wooden structure, but anchored into steel, this structure was able to survive, albeit damaged. It took a month to make the repairs to open that bridge again in '55, but it did withstand the onslaught of the worst flood on the Delaware in at least since colonial times.
The bridge had survived, damaged but intact, and it would survive more devastating floods in the early part of the 21st century. And now, more than 200 years after Lewis Wernwag laid out his first drawings, more than 2 centuries after Benjamin Parry first conceived of the notion of connecting these two communities by way of foot, a bridge stands here. Simple, elegant, strong, and perhaps most importantly, still very much useful and very much needed.
Current traffic is a little over 14,000 vehicles a day, probably about 525,000 vehicles annually. It's been fairly consistent over the last decade.
The bridge is as popular with pedestrians as it is with vehicles, with as many as 14,000 people crossing on foot on a busy weekend day.
In the summertime, especially on days where there's the Shad Festival or something like that, it would probably be well over that as well.
That's more than 3 times the number of pedestrians who walk the Brooklyn Bridge on a daily basis.
For our business, it's instrumental. The bridge being right there brings people almost directly to me. They're right at my doorstep.
Today, the bridge is celebrated with festive parades on cold winter mornings, with fireworks displays on warm summer evenings, and even with a friendly rivalry that takes place on Thanksgiving Day morning. It's been the backdrop for the first day of the rest of our lives, the source of artistic inspiration. But most importantly, it's a structure that has been solidly functional as it faithfully serves to connect these two communities.
That river has tried to keep us apart, and at one time it was a barrier to actually save the fledgling nation. But the bridge actually brought us all together to make it one community.
We all take pride in it, and in a sense, all the residents on both sides own the bridge.
And what might the next 200 years hold for this bridge?
I would say without New Hope, there would be no Lambertville, and without Lambertville, there'd be no New Hope.
As long as there's a New Hope and a Lambertville, there'll always be a bridge there.
Being that it's so scenic, it will always be preserved and enjoyed by everyone that comes into the area.
Something we'll always have, and if anybody ever tried to do anything to take it away, I don't think I'd want to be around, because I think it would get nasty.
I think that it will be forever, indefinitely. There's no doubt in my mind. I don't care if it's 50 years from now, 100 years from now. I think that we're bonded, and that will never change.
How would Benjamin Parry react if he were around 200 years after the fact? What would Lewis Wernwag do if he were here today? Perhaps the same thing that those of us who live or work in New Hope and Lambertville do. Swell with pride whenever we take notice of our magnificent bridge that will connect us forever.